If you read the title of this video and you're like, really? Bluffs that always work? Totally fair, you caught me. It's a little hyperbolic to say the least. No bluff is going to work 100% of the time in 100% of spots. However, the bluffs we're going to talk about today still work way more often than they should on average, and these are things you should be putting into your own game as well. We're going to break them all down in this video. Let's get started. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit. I'm a poker player, coach, and author, and I've been playing this game for about 2 decades now. And the bluffs we're going to talk about in this video have been working for years, and I suspect they will continue to work for many years going forward. And honestly, this is just because players make a lot of mistakes against these plays, and if you can learn how to implement them, and today we're going to talk about exactly that, these can be very lucrative for you as well. So let's get started. So the first bluff we're going to talk about is actually a preflop one, and this is one that every solid aggressive player has in their back pocket, and that is simply leveraging more in position 3-betting. So let's just start with a very simple example. Say you're playing 6 max online, under the gun opens to 2.5 big blinds, folds to you in the cutoff with king 7 suited, and you decide to 3-bet this up to 8 big blinds total. Now, one of the reasons why bluffs like this tend to work so well is that especially in micro and smaller games, players tend to react very predictably against that 3-bet, and most players don't 4-bet anywhere near enough, especially in smaller games. So because of that, you can 3-bet this in a lot of situations where people are going to shunt most of their decisions simply between folding and calling, and when they call, usually with a pretty predictable range, when they 4-bet, that's also quite predictable and usually quite nutted, and as such, a lot of the other stuff is simply going to be folds, and if you can find situations where your opponents are simply going to roll over a lot of hands and even a few extra hands simply because they'd be out of position if they continued, that is where you can find some really nice profitable spots where all of a sudden their folding frequency might actually be 5, 10, 15, 20% higher than it would normally be in a given spot where maybe you were out of position instead. Now there are a few caveats to keep in mind here. One is that you definitely want to be careful doing this against fish, since fish are just inherently going to find the fold button less often pre-flop, but that being said, okay, they continue, you still have position, you still have hopefully a hand that's okay, and that kind of brings us to tip number 2, is that equity driven hands are going to do much better here. So things like ace-x suited or king 7, king 9, that kind of hand suited is also going to do much better. You do have some blocker value in your hand, which is great, and of course you have a hand that if your opponent continues, well, it has decent equity and more equity than something like jack 4 offsuit or something like that. So be careful against fish. You typically want to stay a little bit stronger against fishier opponents just to take advantage of the fact that they don't fold as often pre-flop, but when you're finding things like nits and basic tags and kind of like average regs in your game, in position light 3-betting is going to be extremely profitable, so be on the lookout for it. And again, what's the worst thing that happens? Your opponent calls, okay, you have initiative, you have position, they're probably going to check, and you can do a lot of interesting things post-flop. So don't just sit here and say, well, I don't have a strong hand, so I can't possibly 3-bet pre-flop. That's not the way I'd suggest thinking about this. So let's jump over to post-flop and talk about bluff number 2, which is the small flop c-bet, big turn barrel. So let's start this one with a very simple example. Say you're playing 2-5 live, find yourself on a flop with $40 in there, you have 10-9 suited on a jack 7-4 with a flush draw board, not your flush draw unfortunately. You c-bet for 15 into that 40, your opponent calls, and you decide to barrel the turn for 70 into 70. So there are a couple of reasons why this tends to work really well, and first and foremost is that against that smaller flop c-bet size, which is becoming more and more normal as the game continues to mature, is your opponent is supposed to continue a pretty decent chunk of the time. But one of the major things that this really takes advantage of, especially again in micro to small games, is that most players in those games tend to raise their monster hands on the flop, regardless of what the size they're facing is. So because of that, when they don't raise the flop and instead they just call it, they tend to tell you, hey, I'm pretty capped in terms of strength. I don't have the ultimate nuts in my hand, which means there's more and more hands in their range when they get to the turn that just simply are not going to be nutted and might not necessarily want to face a lot of pressure, yet alone a pot-sized bit of pressure. Alright, so I personally think it's pretty important to understand the basic mathematical underpinnings and what's going on here. So one of the things we can use is my free spreadsheet. This is the break-even percentage spreadsheet. Leave a link for this in the description box. Definitely suggest you download and play with it. But let's just say in this exact spot, right, it's a $70 pot. We are firing it for $70. So the break-even percentage is 50%, which means that if our opponent folds more often than 50% of the time, we make an auto profit, which of course is great, especially when we're just sitting here with 10 high right this moment. So I would definitely suggest studying spots like this between sessions, and if you use a tool like say Flopzilla Pro, which I already plugged in this spot and just gave our opponent a possible preflop range and a possible continuance range on the flop that did not include the super strong stuff, again taking out sets, assuming that most opponents are going to end up raising that on the flop, especially when there's a flush draw present, but by the time they get to the turn on the 3 of hearts, let's just say they're going to continue with what, top pair or better, they're going to continue with their flush draws, and that's it. Notice that they are folding 52.4% of the time. Well, based upon the break-even percentage, it's slightly profitable, but if we actually kind of cover in just a little bit and go into top pairs, are they really going to continue against a potter on the turn with Jack 8, with Jack 9, even with Jack 10? I don't know. I think that's kind of debatable. So that folding frequency from our opponent can get higher and higher and higher. And again, that bigger bet is applying more and more pressure. And that can be a very, very lucrative spot for us to get in there, apply a lot of that pressure, and just take advantage of both of their flop continuance range and the predictability of that, and also just simply the raw mathematics going into that bigger size turn bet. Definitely be on the lookout for this one. It is massively, massively helpful, especially in single raise pots, but even sometimes in 3-bet pots. And by the way, if the terms and concepts we just discussed are like way over your head right now, you're really not familiar with them, please, please, please do the Preflop and Math workbook. Thank me later. It has all the terms that we're talking about today, has all the formulas, lots and lots of practice. If you've seen these things and you're like, okay, I know them, but I haven't really worked with them enough, get the post-flop workbook instead, possibly the advanced one, but at least start with the post-flop workbook if you haven't already. It will help you work through all of this stuff, learn the stuff you need, drill it the way you need it between sessions, and it's going to massively change your game. SplitSuit.com/preflop or postflop or advanced based upon the workbook that's right for you. And the third bluff that works way more often than it typically should is the river overbet. Alright, so let's look at another example and really dig into this one. So let's just say we're playing 2-5, the pot is 40 on the flop, we end up getting there with 4-3 suited, the flop is 10-9-5 with 2 clubs, good for us, we decide to c-bet for 25, our opponent calls. Turn is a deuce of hearts, we decide to barrel for 60, our opponent calls again, king of spades on the river, and we decide to barrel for 350 into a $210 pot. So interestingly enough, the reason why this bluff tends to work is very similar to why the previous bluff tends to work, and that is that our opponents tend to be very capped when they continue or call on the flop and turn. When they just call both of those streets, chances are we can start removing a decent chunk of really strong hands from their range, and as such, by the time they get to the river, they're fairly capped out, they probably don't have a ton of strength left in there. Maybe they have things like one pair hands that are decent, but are they really going to love facing a big bet on the river? In this situation especially, I'm not so sure about that. And just like the previous bluffs, it's important to understand the underlying math behind these things. So if we run the break-even percentage on this one, again firing 350 into a $210 pot, that's a break-even percentage of 63%. So especially when we're looking at this specific spot, right, where the river card is not just an overcard, but it's also feels a lot of pressure, it looks like something could definitely improve us as well. Is our opponent really going to continue with 10x, with 9x, even if they have something like King Jack? Are they really stoked about facing such a large bet on the river? I mean, especially when you think those strong 1-pair hands are going to be going away, or possibly even strong 2-pair hands, it is a very, very good spot to heavily consider going for that river bet, especially going for the very, very large size. And it may not necessarily be 1.5x, maybe it's something like 1.2, maybe it's even 2x pot, but definitely get a little creative and do a little bit of exploration on this and understanding what your break-even percentage is going to look like based upon some different overbet numbers. That can be extremely good exploration to do between sessions. And with all bluffs, it's really important to understand that they're not going to work 100% of the time, right? Some chunk of the time your opponent is going to wake up with a strong enough hand and they're going to continue, and that's baked into the entire equation, especially when you start looking at the EV of these actual bluffs, which we're not going to talk about in this video because it kind of goes a little bit longer than I necessarily want for this particular video. So I know most players tend to be more fearful about bluffing because they just simply don't want to lose money, they don't want to feel foolish when their opponent happens to wake up with a big hand, but you need to understand that that's baked into the equation. If you only ever fire for value and the nuttish value if nothing else, that's not great, right? It's very, very easy to beat you, and it's not going to be a long-term strategy. You have to have bluffing in your game, and having these 3 bluffs especially is going to be very, very helpful and lucrative, especially in micro to smaller games where your opponents are quite predictable. It's very easy to find someone who's a non-fish and very easy to implement these plays if you're looking for them. But also note that you can go a lot deeper in the analysis of bluffs, and especially when you're doing off-table exploration, definitely make sure to do that. If you're like, I don't really know how to start with that, watch that video next. next, we'll go through the EV of a couple of different bluffs together, take it step by step, and have you understanding bluffing and the EV of it much better. Watch that one next. I'll see you back shortly with a brand new video. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.